Well, excellent. According to my time, we are just past 1:30. I'm joining you from Michigan. I know we have people from all over the world who are joining us today. My name is Chris McKenna, the founder of Protect Young Eyes, and I am so excited to be with you, but also to be joined by some experts today to talk about a very important topic. I just want to welcome you to this first webinar, which will be a part of a series of critical conversations from the human change movement. And today is titled The Global Movement for a Smartphone-Free Childhood. We'll be discussing approaches, challenges, and successes. And as I stated, I'm joined by three esteemed guests that you'll have a chance to meet in just a moment. And after a brief introduction of all of them, we'll have a short discussion lasting around 30 to 35 minutes. And afterward, there will be a time for questions from each of you. So I know many of us are very familiar with Zoom. You can drop those questions into the Q&A. And we have Maria behind the scenes from Human Change who'll be helping to moderate those so that we have a chance to answer those after the presentation time with our experts. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, the Human Change Movement was launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2024, just this past January, hosting 12 powerful panel discussions at the Human Change House. And these sessions brought together international experts to debate and discuss issues and solutions around how social media and the digitalization of the world are changing our children and how those changes will impact future societies, all of us and those to come, right? And just as the consequences of climate change require us to protect the environment, the consequences of human change require us to protect and prepare our amazing children in a digital world. Friends, the bottom line is this: digital connections cannot replace real human connection. And I'm thrilled to extend this discussion that we started in Davos to this discussion today. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our experts that we have with us here today. First, I'd like to start with Professor Marco Gui. He's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Research in Milano Bicocca, Italy. His research tends to focus on the harmful cognitive impacts that smartphones and digital devices can have on children and young adults, as well as understanding an ideal age for young children to interact in these digital spaces. Professor Marco is also the co-founder of Digital Packs, very important for this discussion, which is a grassroots community in response to social media and families. So welcome, Marco. Next, I want to introduce to you Claire Fernahoff. Claire is a business psychologist with a background in broadcast journalism. She's now the principal psychologist at Pern Candela LLP, where she uses psychology to achieve behavioral change in organizations. But her role here maybe is seen as something that she never expected. She is the co-creator of the Smartphone Free Childhood, a grassroots UK campaign that started with a viral Instagram post, which then led to WhatsApp groups of local parents supporting each other in their decision to delay giving smartphones to their kids. Thousands of other parents have joined, and it quickly spun into over 60 local smartphone-free childhood groups across the UK. And now that has turned into tens of thousands of parents in groups globally and has received significant media attention. In fact, Jonathan Haidt, author of The Anxious Generation, which I'm sure many today have read, also held a virtual meeting with Claire and the Smartphone Free Childhood team as a part of his recent book tour. And then finally, we have Dr. Jim Winston. Dr. Jim has over 30 years of experience as a clinician in psychology with extensive experience observing and treating patients with addiction. He's also the trustee for the Winston Family Foundation, which seeks to address issues of national importance related to health and well-being, specifically focused on child and adolescent brain development. Dr. Winston is not only supporting the theoretical and academic side of the Human Change Project, but also is leading the public advocacy fight and is a father trying to also parent well in the digital age. He is planning a documentary series expanding on the success of the social dilemma. And a quote from Dr. Jim, which I think summarizes much of what we want to talk about today, is this. He said, kids are incapable of managing the digital overstimulation that they're given. Social media companies know this and have weaponized it. They exploit this vulnerability to keep kids glued to their screens and apps, which is a great introduction to what we are going to discuss today. So, friends, experts, I'm going to now turn a couple of questions over to you. And again, for those of us joining here today, I'd be happy to receive in the chat maybe where you are, where you're joining us from. But also don't forget to drop into the Q&A as we're hearing from Marco, Claire, and Dr. Jim. Anything that's on your mind, drop it in there. And we'll do our best to address it once we're done with this part of the webinar. Marco, I'm first going to start with you with a question. What prompted you, right? I don't know that when you were a young boy, if this is what you dreamed that you would be doing someday, right? But what prompted you to focus on smartphones as a driver of the youth mental health crisis that we find ourselves in globally today?
Thank you, Chris. Well, I was doing research on digital inequality, which is one of the topics of my of interest as an academic. And I started to realize that it wasn't only the lack of access or the lack of skills that led to educational poverty, but it was also the unguided and uncontrolled use of digital media that could lead to this. So when my children reached the age at which the problem impacted me personally also, I reached out to other parents in my community, and we started to discuss the issue of smartphones as the tool with which this excessive use was mainly done. And so when we discovered that another group of parents had done the same in Italy, we started this network called Patti Digitali, Digital Pacts, which has the objective to help groups of parents to decide a specific age for giving a smartphone to their children, but also to organize together a good digital education. So Digital Pacts has now more than 100 groups throughout Italy, and we are working to help them and to enlarge the network.
Thank you for that, Marco, and how amazing to hear that there were others, right? You started this question and it was as if other parents sort of woke up and said, wait, that's me too, and started coming alongside you. And Claire, I think that's a great then segue into you and your story. Here you have a background in psychology, organizational psychology, and now here you are fighting for maybe childhood in a way that you never thought that you would be. So tell us a little bit about your journey and how all of this in your background has woven itself together.
Absolutely, and it really resonates. Everything that Marco has just said, it's remarkably, yeah, there's so many similarities. So yeah, I've been worried about the issue of children and smartphones and social media in particular for a while. But for a few years, it felt like no one else seemed to be worried about this. But me and my friend Daisy, we'd been increasingly talking about it. And then we've both got daughters who are 9 or 10. And she actually saw something that happened in Spain. And she saw two mums had set up a WhatsApp group and they got 1,000 people within a day. And she sent it to me and said, oh, how should we try this? And we sort of laughed and said, well, why not? Let's try it. And so we did the same thing. We created a WhatsApp group. She then posted on Instagram about it and it went viral and people just started joining. We got 1,000 people within the first day. We got 2,000 within the second day. We couldn't have any more people on one group, so we created communities, and we were very much learning as we went because we'd never done anything like this before. And it just kept spiraling. But our main reason that we did it is because we just felt that as parents, we're in this ridiculous position at the moment. You know, in the UK, the average age to get a smartphone is about 11. That's when you go to secondary school. And yet we know that brings such a range of huge harms, but no parent or very few parents want to deny their children one because they don't want to be the odd one out. So this seemed like to us like a mad situation to be in. So we thought, let's just talk about it. And we never ever could have predicted what would happen next. And it's still baffling to us because we've now got 150,000 parents across the UK, and the movement has gone global as well. So yeah, I don't really know how it happened. But in terms of my experience, combining my journalism which has been really helpful in the storytelling and the, cutting through in the message, but also the psychology. I work with clients on how to change social norms, and that feels very, very much what we're trying to do here. So yeah, it's been a bit of a synergy. And with me and Daisy and her husband Joe, we've been lucky enough to have a collection of skills that's kind of propelled us forward a bit.
And that collection of skills and your heart as a mother and just all these things sort of coming together in a beautiful way. And all that you just described is a matter of months old. I'm correct in that, right? This is all 2024 that you're talking about in terms of that growth and that movement. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started a WhatsApp group. I think it was the last few days of January. I then went out to a party on Saturday night, and I came back. Oh, there was 200 people on the group, and then the next day, that's when it started going. So yeah, it's very hard to believe it's just been a few months. It's been a very, very tiring few months, and certainly I've spent way too much time on my own phone and on WhatsApp. But yeah, it's been very exciting as well.
Right. And I've seen them popping up with that logo that is just so recognizable in Ireland, in the US, and all kinds of different places. So you've done a great job scaling that. So thank you, Claire. And Dr. Jim, same question to you. A little bit of the path. How did you get on this path? And what is it that intrigues you so much about this specific topic?
So I got into this inadvertently. I used to walk, my kids now are 16 and almost 14. About 8 years ago, I was one of those nerd parents that walked their kids into school. We would pass upper school students coming the other way. And every day we would get bumped into, knocked off the small sidewalk because all the kids were on their phones. And some of them would look up, but most of them would say, sorry, but keep going. And as an addiction guy, this was really kind of horrifying to me because one of the elements of addiction is interference with, let's call it the survival instinct, right? So we would see kids falling off the sidewalk, spraining ankles. And so there was something powerful about the device that really took kids hostage, if you will. It was more important for them to be down their device while they're walking. They weren't communicating with other people. So I got into the weeds on this and really met a guy named Nicholas Carr who wrote a book called The Shallows, met with him, and then jump-started a center at UNC Chapel Hill, and it's since sort of scaled, and we're really trying to address the neurobiological transformation that's happening as a result of kids spending so much time on their devices. Again, it's not an hour a day. The average now is about 8.5 to 9 hours a day. And if you think about that in the waking time, it's half your waking life for kids. And it has a dramatic impact. Not only we're seeing that expressed in the emotional consequences, the Surgeon General here, the increase in depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, in particular cutting for girls. But it's really, our focus is on the device itself. There's been a plethora of research about social media and the harms that it causes. But for me, again, through the lens of addiction, you really are carrying your drug around in your pocket, qualitatively different than any drug before. You can't carry around your iPad in your pocket conveniently. So access to a drug really facilitates the development of this attachment. And I'm particularly horrified by some of the burgeoning research that shows that the neurobiological changes are correlated with every other addictive process we know. Cocaine, in particular, slot machines, because they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. But I really do see, and you can see it if you've ever tried to take, the phone away from a 9-year-old who's addicted. They throw tantrums, and it's symptomatic. It fits very well within the profile of addiction. So I've sort of, my kids do not have phone. My older son now has a phone. He got it at 14 and a half, simply because of the neurobiological arc and the development of the brain. So it's become a personal passion. And, I am frustrated by, even with my younger son who doesn't have a phone, having to fight for his attention when he's on his computer. It's kids are easily taken hostage by a device that's architecturally designed to be addictive and to capture their attention. So that's kind of my backstory.
Yeah, interesting, right? Not that different from what we just heard from Claire. It's that living it and watching it and experiencing it as a parent or as a caregiver that I think brings so much of it into focus, where you can see what is going on. And then talking to others even brings it into greater focus. And so, Marco, I want to then pivot that back toward you. I'm really intrigued by the grassroots way in which you, in community by community, right? You go into specific communities and you try to establish this social sort of norm perspective about it, right? What's going to work for this specific community that you're working in, and combining that with some of your research on what's the appropriate age and so forth. I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on that. And maybe that also allows you to dig a little bit deeper into digital packs and how it supports that idea of going into a community to create those packs. But if you could expand on that, it might help some other parents see how it tactically can work instead of just being a big idea. And if you could unmute for me, thank you.
Sorry about that. So we noticed that families decide by themselves when they have to choose an appropriate age, and that it's very difficult to do it alone. And in fact, the appropriate age is a social norm, because you need a community to give you an indication in order not to fight, as Jim was saying. And so we just helped each community to decide their own appropriate age. In the majority of cases, this is 7th grade, and this is a compromise between different positions and different also pressures that we have also from schools that ask for online homework. We don't know if this is the optimal appropriate age, but for sure, this method has helped thousands of families realize what they wanted for their children in terms of times of digital education.
And so by having those conversations to understand what some of the dynamics, some of the pressures, some of the realities, interesting, right, that you mentioned homework as being a pressure at times to have access to certain digital spaces, but understanding that as a reality. I think that's a very holistic way of doing this, right? Finding that balance between what's the number, but what works best within the culture, which within the social network that you're working in. I think that's really intriguing. That's fascinating. And Claire, building on that, right? That sort of grassroots kind of approach. Obviously, your movement, the Smartphone Free Childhood, received a massive amount of media attention. I was reading all about it. I remember when people first were saying through my own social media pages, Chris, have you seen this thing that's happening, over in the UK, which was really exciting. I'm just a big fan of helping ideas become tactics. There's a lot of big ideas. I think a lot of us know the internet is broken. A lot of us know that social media for certain individuals can be toxic. But for other parents listening in other countries, how are you able to put movement and action into something that you just kind of knew in your heart wasn't quite right? Any thoughts that you could share for other parents out there? Why do you think now? What was it about the end of January and an Instagram post that maybe caused the types of action that you saw take place?
I think it's a really good question. And I think there's probably a few different reasons. I think firstly, so my co-founder Daisy, who wrote the post that went viral, she's a journalist, and I think she found a way of expressing something in a way that everyone else was feeling in such a simple way that it just cut through all the noise, because there is so much noise. And since then, I think that's been one of our key strengths, just to keep the messaging absolutely razor sharp and so simple, so that people can just really quickly understand what we're trying to say. And it's a very simple thing. Essentially, delay giving smartphones to your children is at its most simple. So I think it is a bit about the messaging. I think it was the timing as well. I think it'd been bubbling up for a long time, and a lot of parents had just been feeling this sense of unease, but just not really vocalizing it. So it's almost like we just lifted the lid on something that had been bubbling for quite a long time. Also, interestingly, that week, and we didn't realize this was going to happen, but Brianna Jai, who was a transgender teenager who was murdered in the UK, her mother launched a campaign 2 days after we set up our first WhatsApp group, and it's calling for exactly the same thing. And that got a lot of publicity. So I think that the two things came together. But in terms of, other helping other parents, I think it's about keep the message really simple and keep it positive. I think something about the name Smartphone Free Childhood that we kind of randomly came up with, it's very positive. It's not scaremongering. It's about this is a vision that we can all aim for. And I think that has resonated. And also just trying not to be judgmental, to be as compassionate as you can, and really hammering home that point that we all want the best for our children, but at the moment we're just in an impossible position. And I think that's been one of the things that's really carried through that message.
I think that last part you said is really important as we talk about this. What I've seen in your messaging isn't what everyone else is doing is wrong. It's an invitation into something potentially more beautiful and better and beneficial to what they're experiencing today. And even in a few others that I've talked to who are familiar with your movement and what you're doing have expressed that. And I think that's what they appreciate quite a bit. I think the other really important takeaway from what you just said, Claire, is that we must keep saying simple things over and over and over again, because you can't predict virality. It's almost like the stock market. You can't time when it's going to go up or down. You just keep investing, knowing over time you'll hit, something will happen, and that's the benefit. And I think that's what I take away from what you're saying is, for those of us feeling this, press on, keep going, keep saying it, say simple things to the right people over and over again. And who knows when they might hit that moment and that tipping point, right, where something really grabs hold, which I think is what you and Daisy and many others have experienced. So now, Jim, getting kind of into the weeds of you as a dad for just a minute, and you alluded to this in your introduction, right, with a couple of sons. You've decided to delay. And I'm guessing that growing up in the house with Dr. Jim as your dad automatically puts you at a bit of a disadvantage as a child in getting away with certain things. But you've made this specific decision around smartphones and social media, despite most of the peers around your children having them. What has that experience been like? What are some of the pressures, even with all the tools that you have at your disposal? What are some of the things that you've experienced in doing that?
So it's been horrible in so many ways, to be honest. But for me as an addiction guy, and now sort of getting into the neurobiology, parents don't let their kids just instinctually watch violence on TV. They don't give them access to porn. And if we just for a second forget the content, the brain is wired to overstimulation, if you will, and we don't let them watch violence because we know it's overstimulating. And kids' brains are not able to incorporate that. The word in psych is they're not capable of integrating it in a healthy way. Kids are all gas and no brake, right? So in the neurobiology, if you look at adolescent brain development, it goes through a massive transformation between the ages of 9 and 14, let's say, a year before puberty, and then where it sort of gets winnowed down, and then the neurobiological foundation for the rest of your life is built. It doesn't mean that it doesn't stay plastic until 25. I think rental car companies know that. You can't rent a car in the US until you're 25. But I wanted to protect that development from the digital drug of a smartphone, because I would not give my kids a slot machine and say, you need to moderate this. I know that they're incapable neurobiologically. And so I felt the same way about smartphones. They were the only ones, and my 13-year-old who's in 8th grade is still the only one in his grade without a phone. And it's been horrible in many ways, but I know that for their long-term development, It's protecting their neurobiological structure. I also know from other longitudinal studies with tobacco and alcohol that the earlier you give a kid cigarettes or alcohol, the worse their life trajectory. If you can keep kids off between 13 and 21, the study was, it decreases their chance between 4 and 5% every year. You can keep them off alcohol or drugs. So if you think about over 5, 6, 7 years, you're decreasing their risk long term of having any dependence or addiction. I feel the same way about phones. I want them to have more access to real life interactions, face to face, being able to connect with and not just do it through a screen. So I have all this resolved because I really do feel like it's in my kids' long-term best interest. And I'm willing to suffer being the bad guy for that payoff long-term.
Something you've said reminded me of one of the conversations that I remember with you and Dr. Mitch Prinstein, a colleague of yours, where he said more or less, we are more responsible for the future wellness of our children than their current happiness. And I've used that phrase to encourage parents many times since I remember, and maybe it was a three-way conversation we were having to give credit where credit is due. But that's what I'm hearing in what you're talking about. There's some short-term suffering, but you're setting your sons up for that healthier long-term trajectory based on what you know about that developmental arc. And I've heard you use a range, 12 to 14, maybe 15. Could you talk a little bit more about that scientifically, Jim? Because I think that why is sometimes necessary for parents to make the hard decision.
Yeah, I picked 14, 14 and a half. If you look at the neurobiological research and you look at a brain of a newborn, it's really very sparse. The brain of an 8-year-old is densely packed. It's like a dense forest. And then it begins to thin out, and it doesn't get to the point where it's a newborn, but it's probably 50%. The atrophying, the parsing down, and it begins to build up. So I don't know who saw Inside Out, that great movie, but it sort of goes through the long. Anyway, I didn't want my kids' brains to be influenced by relating through a device because there's no visceral nutrition through a device. None. There's visceral nutrition in face-to-face conversation. If you think about it, it's weird, but dimensionality, eye contact, facial expression, the music in somebody's voice, the way they're holding you can read all kinds of things. And I think the fact that kids are doing this 8 and 9 hours a day through is a contributing factor into the huge anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. Studies have shown that empathy is down 40%. We all can understand this. So I really, 14 and a half, when they get to high school, I feel like it's more important. They're able to have some break. The prefrontal cortex, which is the newest part of the brain, is the latest to develop. It takes the longest to develop. So there isn't a natural break system in kids. So they're very influenced by peers. And if something happens at school, I know my kid, my 13-year-old, that can't penetrate into his home. And I think that's a lot of what happens is if kids are bullied at school, they don't have that natural boundary. They can send it through a phone and kids can't escape. So that's where my firewall came from. And, I had to feel really good about it because it was not a popular decision, to say the least.
Yeah, a very appropriate use of the word firewall there in terms of what we're talking about with technology. And I think that's great. Dr. Crystal Collier, who's an author here, I recently spent some time with her, and she said, we as parents and caregivers need to be the frontal cortex for our kids and to operate that part of their brain, which may not be fully plugged in to create those natural breaks as in a car that they just don't have. So I think that's what you're getting to there is we're oftentimes asking them to do something and to regulate something that none of us as children their age would have been ever able to do, right? Brains haven't changed that much that quickly. And
No,
so,
and they're capable. And I think to put pressure on them is really not just unfortunate, but I think it's, from where I said unacceptable. It's not that they're not much, but to recognize that they don't have the neurobiological capacity of, for example, measuring future consequence. None of those ingredients are in place at age 10, 11, 12, 13, even 14. They start, morality, depending on who you listen to, begins to develop around 15, 16, 17. So they don't have any of those consequential understandings.
So fascinating and so helpful, I think, to encourage some of those difficult decisions. Claire, I want to pivot back to you, and then Marco, I'm going to bring a similar question your way after Claire. There's a lot of language, whether it's in schools or even in this conversation, around banning or delay. Does that mean that that's the ultimate goal? If we decide not to give them technology, we're done, and we can just say we're good. Or if we remove smartphones from schools, we're good. Or what else do we as caregivers and parents need to have in mind here other than just wait in this particular way?
Absolutely. And we try to not use the word ban because we know just how divisive it is, and it tends to kind of put people off. So we tend to talk about restricting the age at which kids can have smartphones. We're fine with the word delay because it really is what it says on the tin. And also important to say, we're not anti-technology at all. We think that laptops absolutely have a role. It's just the uninterrupted 24/7 access to the whole entire world in your pocket, which is clearly not doing kids much, it's not really helping them. But there is another side of the coin, and that is all the other stuff and all the way society is changing. And Jonathan Haidt, as you will all know, is fantastic on this. And it's the free independent play that kids aren't getting. It's the way society has changed, that kids are not now going out the back door and playing with their friends outside. Youth centres have closed. We live in a different way. We live in a more individualistic society, and often kids are more isolated. And so I think, as a parent, I see my responsibility is to try and turn that back a little bit, because it's those real life experiences, it's those knocks and scrapes that they have with their friends that build that resilience. And I truly believe that that's another reason why we're seeing the rise in anxiety, because we don't let them walk down to the end of the road to buy a packet of crisps, but we do let them into completely unrestricted social media platforms. So I think what they're doing in the real world is just as important in terms of how we need to be thinking about it. So no, it's not just about delaying. That is obviously a huge part of it, but it's the other side of the coin as well that we really need to be focusing on.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Claire. Marco, how would you extend that? You've had many conversations, real conversations, one-on-one with families and parents and others who in certain communities that you're working with are trying to wrestle through these decisions. What are some of the other tactics that you're seeing them put in place to kind of wrap around this delay decision? But are there other things that the families you're working with are also doing to help support that decision?
I think that one of the challenges for this, let's call it global movement, is to distinguish between positive, significant uses of technology apt for certain ages, and on the other side, the exploitation of attention, of data that commercial platforms are doing to our children. So far, the majority of digital media used by children is on this second dimension. So a ban can be useful if it limits this second dimension until we find better ways to promote positive uses. So I think another very important goal is to provide families with positive examples of significant uses then they can do of digital media at specific ages. So I think this movement has to be open to what research will clarify in the next years. And we also must be aware that research can also be biased, as it happened in the past with tobacco or other issues. And at the same time, we need to provide solutions for now, because family has a need in this very moment.
They do. And you hit on something there. And Claire, I'm actually going to bounce back to you to extend something that Marco just spoke about, because we're seeing some of this even now in the Q&A. So we're going to kind of answer something early, but I think it's very pertinent to the path that we're on right now. What I'm hearing in both of your answers isn't that we are anti-technology. And I think that's an important thing to elaborate on a little bit. We do live in a world where technology is a big part of the world. And so could you just expand on that a little bit as you've had conversations? I'm sure parents have pushed back with you even to say, wait a minute, are you saying that all technology is bad? Maybe even AI, we shouldn't even look at it. How do you answer parents who maybe challenge this movement with those kinds of questions?
Yeah, and I think this is when it comes back to the messaging is just so important. We're not anti-technology, we're pro-childhood. And, one of the strongest arguments against delaying is, well, children need to learn, they need to be digital natives, they need to learn how to use technology. But we draw the distinction between the technology which is helping us and the technology which is exploiting us and exploiting our children. Children need to learn how to code, to use, Microsoft programs, to learn to use the internet, to research, and all the brilliant things. But when it becomes a problem is when they are being used by technology and they are the product. And so I think people are conflating two things. Learning how to use, to code, for example, is very, very different to being essentially exploited by a social media platform, which is very predatory and is designed to suck us in and take our time. So I think when people say that to us, we draw that distinction. The other thing I want to say is that that's a narrative that comes from the tech companies, which is that, oh, well, everyone needs to learn. I think parents get fooled. I think schools also get persuaded that, oh, well, no, they're going to miss out. But, you can see, if you only need to go onto YouTube to find a chimpanzee looking at Instagram, chimpanzees know how to use phones. So if they know how to, then there's not an argument that children need to have them at a younger and younger age. That is coming from companies who are making a lot of money. So we kind of make that point, and yeah, it seems to work quite well.
Great, thank you. Marco, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Yeah, Jim, go ahead, and then Marco will come back to you. Yes.
So I totally agree with the exploitation. I think that's tech companies' primary motive, is to make all that kind of stuff. I would also add, and this goes along with Jonathan Haidt and what it's keeping kids from, is that kids are often, they have a large social network, but it's primarily through a screen. And I'm convinced, as a clinician guy, that the visceral connection that kids are now almost avoiding, you can see, it becomes a soothing aspect, going to your phone if you're getting, they're not forced, maybe that's not the right word, they're not challenged to learn how to deal with anxiety in a social dynamic, or if they upset someone, if they make someone mad, if someone gets, and all those visceral components now are stripped of a large part of kids' social experience, which is through a screen. And that, to me, separate from these platforms' exploitation, is a huge component in why kids are so, in particular adolescents, are so anxious and depressed, and we're seeing them go off the rails, because that kind of visceral connection is the way deep and meaningful interactions and attachments grow, because it's dimensional. And I think our brains, if you think about 50,000 years ago, the context was very different. And we're meant to connect viscerally to people. It was the family unit, and it's being able to look across the room and see somebody's eyes and know exactly what they're thinking. I think that's part of the deleterious effects now of not just an hour a day, but almost 9 hours a day connecting through a screen.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Marco, I know you wanted to add more to that. Please do.
Yeah, as Jim said, adolescents have to experience face-to-face experience, but at the same time, They also live in a very digitalized context, so they need to also develop digital skills and the skills to thrive in this society. But there has been, in my opinion, a misunderstanding on the term digital skills. You don't develop digital skills if you watch the reels on TikTok or on Instagram, but the development of critical digital skills is something more complex. So one of the hot debates we have in our network is about homework online. So schools ask for online homeworks, and this is good in a sense because some of these activities are meaningful, but at the same time, it opens the possibility of spending the whole afternoon fighting for finding the focus, etc. So one of the challenges, another challenges we have, is to find safe environments where you can distinguish between different kinds of activities. So you can leave your child in an autonomous way to develop his or her digital skills, but without being exposed to the other environment of exploitation that we have mentioned.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's a helpful context to wrap around this. A simple phrase we sometimes use is right tech at the right time, right? We're talking about exploitive, algorithmic features, right, that are targeting, that are serving up in rabbit holes of information to brains that simply aren't ready yet, too much too soon. And so one of the questions I'm seeing here in the Q&A, which I think is an extension of this, is there's some questions related to educational technology in the classroom, which is a whole different webinar, a whole different topic. But I can tell you that as a father to a son with special needs, there are transformative uses of technology that can be targeted in a way to help. But that's not what we're talking about many times in the conversations, right, that the three of you have had and that we're seeing in this debate. And I think that's a very important differentiation to add a lot of context to that anti-tech conversation that I think sometimes this is minimized to, and that's really not where we're going with this. So I guess with that, then maybe just to tee up another aspect of this. So what about parental controls, right? They're out there. Why don't we just use them? Isn't that the silver bullet? If we just found the right parental controls, wouldn't that solve all of this? Claire, you have children that are in that age. I know that I do too. What would you say to a parent who is looking for that as a silver bullet answer or the perfect solution in all of this?
So to sum up very briefly, they don't work. So they just don't tend to work. As far as I can see, if you need a PhD in some sort of computer programming to be able to understand them, there are many, many different ones that you need to try and set up, and children know how to get around them. And if they don't, their friends in their class will know how to download a VPN and get around it, and we see it all the time. So I think that parents have been sold a bit of a lie about parental controls, and they believe that they work and they don't. And the thing that's very frustrating is that they could work. It would be possible to make parental controls that are simple to set up and really protect children, but it comes back to the financial interests, and at the moment tech companies don't have a financial incentive to do that. It's far better if children are addicted and they see more and more extreme content, and that makes them click again and again. And so, yes, if they did work, that would be a wonderful thing. But the thing is, there's still the issue of the opportunity cost. So it's not just about the content, it's about the time spent. So parental controls, well, unless they could really, really, kind of affect the time. But the problem is, it's just that thing in your brain, isn't it? I'm just going to check my phone. And that's why kids are spending 8 hours a day on their phones. So at the moment, they just don't work.
They don't. And it's a phrase that we have in the US is it's a bit of a square peg in a round hole. the device and the digital spaces aren't designed for kids. Do we really think a toggle, a switch, or software is going to magically design them in a way that they're beneficial for children? And I just think we need to remember what they're really trying to do and how minimal the chances of being successful there. Marco, you're unmuted. Is there something you'd like to add to that, please?
Yeah, as a sociologist, I must say that this is also a problem of social inequality, because parental controls, as Claire said, are complex. So what is the percentage of families that have the skills to use them? And we know from research that it's very low, and they are all highly educated persons. So we need something simple. We need something simple that you can activate. And I'm sure, as Claire said, that this is possible in many different ways, through networks or through the devices, or both of them. But there must be a social pressure on companies and governments because this happens.
Absolutely. And I would argue that there, in some cases, isn't any level of education that overcomes their complexity. I remember being on a plane next to a PhD professor from the University of Georgetown who figured out what I was doing and was lamenting how helpless she felt in the face of YouTube, unable to figure out how to make it safer for her daughter. I'll never forget that conversation. So, well, thank you so much. We have quite a bit of action going on in the Q&A, and I'm going to pivot there next to cover as much of that as possible. Some of you have been answering some of the Q&A questions just organically in the conversation we've been having here. Jim, I'm going to lob the first one your way. There are a number of questions here, since we're focused primarily on smartphones and social media, that have kids who love video games. And that's a very common extension of this conversation. I'd love your thoughts from a clinician, from an addiction standpoint. What would you say to parents who, well, it's not social media, my kid doesn't even want Snapchat, but I can't get them off of Fortnite? Like, how would you talk to that family?
So again, the brain, which is my area of focus, doesn't care about content. It cares about stimulation, right? So overstimulating things access survival instinct, which is the basic, reason for existence. And if it's overstimulating, if it's to follow up with Claire, if it's fringe, lurid, or it really activates a survival principle that I believe these tech companies have weaponized, because the algorithms all drive kids to more and more kind of the dark areas, because the brain gets stimulated and then you want to see more. It's a visceral response to what's on the screen. So gaming does that. They have all kinds of, scaffolding systems where if you just get one more and kids are incapable of managing it. So I really try and focus on the brain and what it responds to, separate from the content, because once again, my focus is our kids are incapable. They shed skins all the time. Their brains are going through massive restructuring. And if we give them something where they're going to become addicted, that means their neurobiology is going where that addictive process is. And that, if it happens between 9 and 14, is there for life. I've dealt with lots of people. I worked in a federal prison, blah, 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 who started drinking at 12. They have a much harder time in recovery than someone who became an alcoholic at 25, because their neurobiology now has accommodated that symptom. That's my focus with smartphones, with all the content.
Right. And my experience in conversations with these companies is that they are acutely aware of how the adolescent brain works. They know as much as any expert around what is going on during this very unique developmental phase, and are very good at taking advantage of that. Thank you, Dr. Jim. I appreciate that. Marco, I want to bring one toward you, and then Claire, I bet you'll have something to add to this. So the idea of FOMO, we've heard of FOMO, fear of missing out, for those who might be unfamiliar with that phrase. And I'm seeing quite a few questions around while we're worried about that in terms of what kids struggle with in constant notifications on social media, but do we create a delay version of FOMO that is harmful to a child in their development socially by not allowing them to interact with all their peers who are in these digital spaces? Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of that balance? Is that a real risk to development? Is that a conversation that you have with parents, sort of weighing the benefit and the cost of one versus the other? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that if all the sociality is online and my child is not allowed to be there, that's a problem, obviously. That's why I think the appropriate age for smartphones and social media is a social issue, because we need to create an environment where things happen in the offline world first for children. And so FOMO is a problem because the environment has shifted too much on the online dimension. And so, yes, a problem we have with families is that if the environment around a family that tries to delay a smartphone is completely online, well, the advantage of delaying is not so sure. But if you succeed in having 6 or 7 children in a classroom with families that make this decision, then you are changing the environment. So FOMO loses its basis in a sense.
Claire, I'd like to maybe also give you an opportunity to speak to this one, because there are different ages that are put out there in terms of what parents should be considering in terms of making this decision. How would you build on, or in your own experience, respond to that question based on what Marco has said?
About the correct ages to have a smartphone. Yeah.
About maybe wrestling with, how do you help parents wrestle through that tension of them feeling like, well, the FOMO my kid is going to feel by being the only one, that is worse to me as a parent than just giving it to them. How do you help talk through that with them?
And that question is exactly why we set up our movement, because it's just an impossible situation. And yeah, you know, we can't deny the fact that being the only one in the class is really, really tough. We do have lots of parents in our community who their child has been one of the very few in the class. And actually some do remarkably well. And we've heard some really positive stories about, actually, well, my child's the cool one because actually when they come around to our house, they actually interact. Whereas at everyone else's house, it's the same because they're on their phones. So I don't think it's impossible, but of course it's not. It's a very hard thing to do. But it's, you know, it comes back to that tipping point of, you know, it takes about 25%. If you've got 25% doing something in a class, then that's enough to just tip the norm slightly. But also they've just got a few people who are in the same boat.
Right.
So I think it's tough, but that's exactly why we did this.
And I think what I'm hearing from both of you is that it is more than just the delay decision. As I've had this conversation with parents, it's then doing very deliberate things related to this decision, telling other parents why you have, being confident in that decision, creating an environment in your home where the kids do want to be, and that they put their phones away and they have fun without them, to even realize that that's a thing. And you do other things around that decision to make it so that others maybe are more apt to come on board, or that others buy into it. You evangelize it in whatever way you can. And I think that's what I'm hearing, is it's more than just saying no. It's also wrapping that decision with other decisions that point in that direction that will help make it successful. So thank you both
for example,
that very much. Claire, was it? Okay, go ahead, Marco. Yes.
Organizing a birthday party without smartphones and explaining to other families why you are doing that. That's a step for a new culture of digital media and pre-adolescence.
Lovely. Great example. Claire, was there something else?
I was just going to say, I think there's a wonderful book by Gabor Mate, if you know it, called Hold On To Your Kids. And he talks about the fact that actually peers have started to matter too much to children, and partly that is because of the digital networks they're all in. But actually, I think it's okay to say, well, still your family needs to be what matters most, and that peer influence is now sort of being overplayed. Of course, it is important at that age, but we need to remember that actually the time with family and is also very, very important.
Can I jump?
Thank you for that.
I just want to jump in for a second. So my older son, who didn't get a phone until he was 14 and a half, so the absence, and he actually came to Davos and spoke about this, the absence of a phone, which really increases, I think we can all agree, distractibility, right? You're always he got into stocks and became really remarkable stockbroker from the age of 10. And he got into photography and did a deep dive. And he can now report that he doesn't, I mean, there's no way to know, but he would never have done those deep dives. And I mean deep dives if he had had a phone, because the lure, I think as parents, we're all aware of the magnetic appeal, not only for ourselves, I think we all have attachment disorders with our technology anyway, but for kids, they are incapable of resisting that magnetic appeal. But I just want to point out that it's an N of one, but my son really got invested in substantive areas and had the time and the capacity to do a deep dive. Again, if he had had a phone, and in the US, we're discovering through the center, most kids now, over 50% of kids are getting phones at age 7. So just think about that for a second. So he now at 16 can say, I'm glad I didn't get a phone. It's the future results that I'm interested in. So I just think that's an important anecdote to kind of put into the mix here. It's not all starvation and loneliness and horror for kids. They can get into things without the distraction.
They can. And they may discover things, as your son did, that they didn't know they loved. I've read so many stories of kids who noticed things walking to school that they never noticed before because they weren't looking down, like graffiti on a wall. I remember reading a story about that specifically. Okay, I feel like I could talk to the three of you until Monday, but I won't make everybody do that. I'm going to end with actually one of the Q&A questions. This is different than how I thought we would end, but I feel as though it's a really important one given all that we've stirred up here. And we'll finish in this way. But the question more or less goes like this: what would your advice be? And if you could, each of you could make this just kind of like a sentence or two, a 30 to 60-second response. What would be your advice to a parent who has already given too much? How do you begin to take a little bit of that back, given all this amazing information that you've shared? So I'm going to start, Dr. Jim, with you, and then Claire, I'll come to you, and then Marco, I will end with you before we finish. So what would you say to that parent who feels like the ship has sailed? There's nothing I can do.
So I'm, of course, going to be the hard guy here, and I would say better to go through withdrawal now than do it at 25. It's much easier, even though they throw tantrums, for them to developmentally work through that process with your support. So I would, and I understand I'm an outlier here, but I would certainly take social media away from anybody under 15. And it's a tough call though, because you're going to have to be willing to be the bad guy and to watch someone genuinely suffer, which, if you've ever known anybody who's gone through withdrawal from alcohol or drugs or gambling, you see the exact same symptoms. That's very tough as a parent to watch.
Thank you, Dr. Jim. I appreciate that. Claire, what would you say to that parent who's sitting in front of you just looking hopeless?
And I really get how hard that is. And it's, it's just impossible. It's very, very difficult. And we have a lot of parents telling us exactly that. I would say I would loop back to something that was you talked about earlier about we have to be the prefrontal cortex for our children. They don't have developed brains like we do, so we have to kind of make those decisions for them. And they may not like it, but we have more, ability to make that decision. I think also if you're flying a plane and you're going off course, you correct, don't you? We have more evidence now, and we're seeing what's happening, and that's when we have to change our approach, however hard it is. And just to finish, we've got lots of people in our community who have taken a phone away. And it's been extraordinary. You know, one person said her personality just began to come back. She started drawing again, writing, reading, all the things she'd stopped doing, playing her violin. And that is what happens when you take a phone away. There's a pain barrier, but, you know, it is possible to go back.
Thank you. Thank you. Marco, finish us off.
One thing we're trying to do in our Italian network is to add some adult efforts in the pact. So this makes it easier because we are all making an effort to change our habits towards a better well-being in the digital sphere. So this makes it much easier.
I love that.
Also modeling for us.
Yeah, that's right. Modeling the behavior we want to see in our amazing children. Well, thank you three so much for this. I feel like we've just tipped a little bit here toward so much more that we could talk about. For those of you that are following in the chat, you'll see more information about each of the organizations that is represented here. You can also keep in touch through social media and also the YouTube page for the Human Change Movement. There will be future webinars. I know there were some questions related to the tech industry and their responsibility or lack of responsibility when it comes to some of these changes. And these will be things that we discuss in future webinars. But for all of us here, and for the Human Change Movement and all over the world, the countries that were represented here, I saw Brazil and Kenya and the UK and the US all over. Thank you so much for being a part of this critical conversation. We wish you all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.